in the space for Ask a Consultant, Data for Storytelling, Part 1. You are in the right place. I am Susie Lee. I'm the Director of Nonprofit Strategy and Engagement at Forefront. And Forefront and the Association of Consultants to Nonprofits dreamed up this program in the very, very early days of the pandemic when none of us had any idea what was going on, and certainly not that it was going to last this long. But the idea was to hold a space for folks to come together and ask questions about anything related to our work and just find a space to connect, because there aren't as many places for us to do that the way we used to naturally at conferences and luncheons and all of that good stuff. So we're really excited about this conversation today. We'll be talking about data in lots of different forms, data for storytelling, and you'll notice the part 1, if you didn't read deeply all of the details on our website, part 1 today is really focused on internal use of data. Part 2, when we follow up, we'll be talking about external use, so stories that we're telling people outside of our organization. I am particularly excited about today's conversation because I came to nonprofit work by way of program evaluation and data collection. When I first got out of my undergraduate work, I was a part of the Japan Exchange and Teaching Program and got involved in collecting data on a program that hosted 5,000 English-speaking teachers across the entire country of Japan, and trying to collect that data and explain the importance of it to the 3 separate government entities that all managed the plan with a completely different goal in mind. So it was a really unique way to start out my work in this area. So I'm excited to hear what all of these experts have to say. But before we really dive in, I have a couple of housekeeping notes. For folks, we are in a meeting setting for the first time for this program. So feel free to turn your camera on, turn your camera off, whatever you're comfortable with. We will ask that folks share their questions in the chat. On my screen, if I hover sort of in the bottom center of the screen, there is the chat function. So you feel free to enter questions there anytime. We'll be starting the conversation off with questions that were entered when folks registered for the program, and then we'll open it up the last 30 minutes of the conversation. The last piece is that we are recording this session. So if you miss something, or if you want to share the great conversation with a friend later, you'll be able to do that from our site. All right, that is a lot from me. Now I wanted to introduce a round robin of introductions of our amazing panel. And Sarah, do you want to get us started?
Sure. My name is Sarah Keister Armstrong, and I'm an independent consultant based in the northern suburbs of Chicago. I've been working in this consultant role with nonprofit organizations and public organizations for about the past 8 years, and I focus on strategic planning, assessment, and grant writing projects. So all that work kind of uses data in different but still meaningful ways. Like Susie, I came to nonprofits by way of a statistics and evaluation background. And I'm really passionate about helping nonprofit organizations kind of build their confidence in talking about data and how it can help us continue to improve the sector.
Sorry, couldn't get to my unmute button. Arthur, do you want to keep us going?
Sure. Welcome, everybody, and it's great to be here. My name is Arthur Padilla, and I am coming to you from the Pacific Northwest. And the best part about the virtual process that we're in is that I get to join you all, which is super great for me. I have been doing nonprofit consulting for about 10, 11 years now, exclusively. Before that, I was doing it, but I've been doing this exclusively for about 11 years. And much like everybody else, I started doing this with data collection and program evaluation. Not any way what I was thinking I was going to do as a consultant, but it ended up being super helpful. And I've been working mostly around the country, primarily in communities of color, and doing mostly evaluation and data collection with staff. So doing empowerment evaluation and development evaluation. So staff are learning how to do their own evaluation stuff internally. That's most of the work I've done and what we'll talk about.
Awesome. Margaret, tell us about yourself.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Margaret Conway. I'm the Director of Learning at Convergence Design Lab. We're a small social impact agency. We're based in Chicago. And we work to build equity and engagement across learning ecosystems. So we're sort of in the general learning sector, from schools to out of school time organizations to adults, libraries, things like that, workforce development organizations, youth media. And we use learning design and research evaluation and strategy to help make programs and initiatives more sustainable and impactful.
Awesome, thank you. So we got such a great collection of questions, and I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Such a great collection of questions in the registration. So thank you all for sending those in. And the place to start is where to get started. Arthur, I know you've done a lot of work with data and readiness and getting different voices involved, but when you're thinking about getting started, where do you tell people to start? Where do you like to start?
Interestingly enough, so the best part about all of this conversation is that it's consulting work. So each one of our clients is a little bit different, and we, develop a relationship with them that depends on what they need. However, for me, primarily, the first thing I try to do very regularly is let's do some kind of readiness assessment. How ready are you to do data collection? What do you need? A little bit about what Margaret refers to in the learning strategy, like what do you need to learn in order to do this? There might be some steps we need to take. And then I also like people to do a process where they go back and look at all the data that they're already collecting. I think one of the most important things about data collection, and especially nonprofits that haven't done this a lot, is affirming what you already do and kind of saying, you already do a lot of this. This is, you're required to do it. And how are we going to create some more structure or organization around it? But the first thing is validating the success. How do we do that? And how do we say, really, this is what you already do? Look, you collect this data, you collect this data. And a lot of that is getting clear about what that data looks like. A lot of folks don't understand what data looks like. When I was a community program officer for a community foundation, one of the things I did was when they got funded, I sent everybody out a camera saying, okay, you got to send that camera back because you got to send me all those pictures because I need data. And so data starts to look like a whole bunch of different things for people. And when you start to instruct people to do that kind of look into their own files and their own systems, they start to pull out things that they didn't realize were data. All of their final reports, all of their, there's just tons and tons and tons of it. And then they start to compile it. And it's really affirming. So for me, that's like the key first place to start. It's super important, and it's fun. It's actually a fun process.
I can jump off of what Arthur said about affirming what organizations already do. It's kind of like in your introduction, when you're introduced to a group, every nonprofit organization has a story. It's, the reason you're funded, the progress you've made, your history, the impact you're telling people you have on your community. So the data you collect should really be viewed as something that connects with that story or makes it more persuasive. It doesn't have to be this whole scary separate entity that can be overwhelming. It's really just supporting the informal conversations you're already having with organizations, whether that's a funder or a volunteer, and thinking of it that way can kind of help you decide, oh, what could boost this argument? What could make my words stronger?
And Margaret, when you're getting started with folks, I know you have a very creative lens when you're thinking about data collecting, and I'm excited to hear more about that. But where do you start?
Yeah, I think it's related to what Sarah and Arthur were talking about, is really looking at what's already happening in the organization and starting with those that are closest to the work, which would be often the staff, the program staff, and then sometimes even the beneficiaries of the program. So whether that's learners or those you serve, right? And kind of collaborating with them to think about what is the impact that you're trying to have, and really putting language to outcomes. I think a lot of times that group of folks, if you can really really start the conversation, they know what success looks like, right? But they may not have been asked in the same way. And so if you can really start with, well, what does success look like? And how do you know when things are working? And then how can we figure out what might be a good indicator of that? And then how might we collect it, right? So when we got everybody involved in that conversation from the very beginning, things start to feel really creative and really aligned, as opposed to, I'm doing this work on the ground and these are these sort of outside people that are deciding what's important to talk about, right? And it results in better quality data and then sort of greater ownership too across the organization.
And for anyone really, one of the things we talked about when we were getting ready for this conversation is that data isn't always numbers, and several of you have touched on that already. But when I'm talking to nonprofits and they're asking, what they want to collect, you all mentioned some things that I had never thought of. So can you talk a little bit about what are data points that aren't what we would typically think of data points?
Go, Margaret.
Oh, you want me to get started? Okay, sure.
Oh,
yeah. Yeah, so I'm wondering if I should, I think it's important to think about being open to different kinds of data and kind of thinking almost about experiences as being possible sources of data, right? So kind of moving beyond, of course, there's a place and use for surveys, but sort of how can we move beyond the survey and expand our idea of what listening can be? And I think that it can really, at least when we're talking about internal data, not necessarily always telling the story externally, although it can certainly help that, is sort of shifting from data collection as this task that we have to do and more, I want to know that we're having an impact and sort of here's a way to know. So I just want to show a couple pictures if that's okay, just sort of thinking a little bit outside the box of some of the things that we've done. This of course may not relate to everyone's organization, but this is one example of a youth media organization that we work with where engaging with real world audiences, so helping young people make media that would then, that real world audiences would engage with, was central to their work and really a part of their logic model. And for us to really think about what is the way that audiences are engaging with the work and how is that then impacting the young people who made the work was really important internally for program strategy and then later on for telling the story. So this was a year-long class, essentially a really heavy-duty workshop where young people sort of form a musical group and write an entire album and perform it. So it's very intensive, right? And they would perform at this music festival in front of hundreds of people. And that was really amazing for them to perform. But often what they had spent the most time doing was writing their lyrics. And they felt like, well, when I sing this, when I like shout this into a microphone outdoors at a venue, people don't really hear what I wrote. And so at the same time at the event, we then blew up the lyrics and invited audience members to engage with it in that way, and then shared it back to the young people that were involved and kind of captured that as data and that as an impact and looked at, well, is it really having the outcomes that we defined in the logic model early on? I mean, as you can imagine, it was super impactful for the young people no matter what, but to really capture that actual point of engagement was really special, and certainly wouldn't have been what people would have written after they left the concert, right? So that was one example. And then one other one is the same thing with a game design class. Young people designed games and they wanted to hear what people said as they played the games, right? So they invited people to an event to play the games. They didn't feel comfortable talking in front of other people. So we set up a system where people could play the game and then ask questions and make comments, and the designers themselves would respond to them in real time. And so then we could capture that as data and look at what are people talking about, what are people asking about, how are young people responding, and how do they feel about that. So those are just like two little sort of playful ways that maybe more of a form of documentation and less quantitative, but really informed programming.
I can jump in with another example. I work mostly in the health and human services area, and I'm working with an organization now that supports older adults, which has been a particularly pointed challenge during the past year with COVID. So they kind of fell into this data collection method. They had a friendly visit program where volunteers from the community would come and visit older adults who were living alone in their homes. And during COVID, that had to transition to friendly visit phone calls. Well, we came up with the idea that at the same time, the volunteers making these phone calls could kind of work into the conversation very casually, oh, what have you been eating? Have you been able to get to the store? Have you been able to go to the doctor, to kind of assess need in that way? And that previously would have been something that was almost like a sterile process, surveying people about their needs, but it worked into this program and it was much more effective that way. And it ended up just being, again, very casual conversations, but a great way of getting that data and then being able to act on it.
So for me, one of the things that we did in Alaska, we were doing a cultural immersion program for young people, urban and rural folks. And these young people were going to be away from home for a week, and they were going to be experiencing a ton of cultural experiences that were challenging in so many ways. So every night, instead of doing pre and post test, every night we just asked them to take their little cell phone and hide themselves somewhere. And for a minute, they would answer 3 questions. And they did that every night as they went through the process. And in that was what we used as one of the indicators. We had 150 young people. So when you start looking at all of those responses, it was a pretty significant amount of folks that were giving data around what their experience was. And then we were able to use that data and correlate it and see what the experiences were, what were folks doing, what were similar experiences, what were challenging experiences, what were some of the points that we were noticing. And then we were able to use that information to adapt the program. Even every time we did that, we would adapt the program based on the young people's feedback. But it is data, right? It was film. It was camera. It was 1 minute of camera, and some kids were like, I don't even know what I'm talking about, right? But that's data, right? That was all information. It was super great and super fun because all the staff got to watch and watch all of these videos. And some of at point they were crying, they were having an emotional response, and I'm like, yeah, that's what data is supposed to do. Yay, that's we're having fun. Yeah, so that's my experience.
I love all of these, out of the box examples that you're giving of, comments that are live at a concert, people that are giving feedback on a computer or in a phone call or through pictures. We're going to dive in a second a little bit more into how to use data, but I'm wondering, before we do that, if you all can talk about, how you get from, okay, so we've collected this bunch of data that's not, kind of typical. It's not 17 people attended program A and then accomplished objective B, it's not that sort of numbers thing, but how do you translate that stuff, the comments and the pictures and the, emotional responses, into something that's communicatable in terms of what most folks would recognize as data collection? Like, how do you start to translate it into telling a bigger story?
I can start this one off. When I am doing any kind of data work like this with clients, I like to really emphasize the difference between outputs and outcomes. One being more quantitative than the other. So outputs are these quantifiable indicators that measure what you're doing, how many phone calls you made, how many people need this, in non-COVID times, how many people walked through your doors this week, that kind of thing. And that kind of, numbers over time show activity, what your organization's actually doing. When you can start pulling together outcomes, that will help tell this story that we're talking about, this narrative of the impact that you're having. So these outcomes tell us more of a story. Has someone's knowledge of something changed as a result of your work? Has a behavior changed? Has how they viewed themselves changed? So in the case of this youth media project, surely that has been impactful, and that kind of narrative would be an outcome. Um, so when sometimes this happens after the fact, especially if it's something like these older adult phone calls that happen accidentally, separating out, well, what's an output and what's an outcome, and how can we show that this is actually making a difference. But keeping in the back of your mind those two separate things, I think will help, not just at a point in time talking about your data, but then being able to measure those across time to show that your actual outcomes are improving, or if they're not improving, how to adjust your programs accordingly. I think that's maybe one of the biggest hurdles to overcome is thinking about the difference between outputs and outcomes.
It's hard to do this virtually because I don't know who's going to talk next. I don't have a big, super well thought out answer to this one, but I do think that something that we always try to do is alongside building these practices of kind of collecting that data, whatever kind of data it is, documenting impact, is in parallel trying to explore structures of an internal community of practice among those that are on the ground, like I said, doing the work, right? Like what we were just talking today with one of our clients who had collected a bunch of sort of exit slip data from young people as they left the program each day, and there was a ton of it, and then there wasn't necessarily a structure to be able to look at it or talk about it or do anything with it. So kind of always talking about, well, who's in the room? How can we build structures that don't feel high pressure, but feel like we're building this together? This is a learning community. We're sharing practices and strategies and giving each other feedback in kind of a safe space, and that it becomes part of the routine of the organization.
And my agenda is almost always about capacity building and getting people to do the work. So not because I'm lazy, but that's not the point. But for me, that suggests that especially with qualitative data, with research and with interviews and all of that kind of stuff, and looking at stuff that's not numbers, right? Looking at all that stuff that's very difficult, that can be overwhelming. I did a project with a political organization, and they were doing a strategic planning process, and their question was, how do I dismantle power? How do we dismantle our power? I'm like, okay, that's complicated. But the reality was they did a lot of interviews. That was really the point of this story. And they did tons and tons of interviews. And then we took all of those interviews and we had them transcribed. And then I sent them all back to them and said, okay, you all have, and everyone got about 3. It was a huge committee and there were a lot of interviews, but each person got about 3, and they had to use a Google form to go through and answer questions that they were actually reading. So you read this, what are the themes that you hear from this? What are all that kind of stuff? So we actually made them walk through the process. The reason I do that is so that they're engaging with the data, right? They're looking at what I'm looking at. And so I'm not making it up. So when I come back and say, these are the recommendations, or this is what percolated as a theme, I'm not making this up, and it's just not my filter. I'm using everybody's filter to say, these are the themes that emerged from our conversation. It's a little bit more intensive work-wise. It's a little bit more iterative, but at the same time, it really does allow folks to get their fingers in there. And that's, to me, the most important piece around all of this is the data literacy issue, is how functional our frontline staff in using data and managing data, because so many people use data to make decisions about our lives, right? Especially as frontline staff, we're like, oh my God, I'm powerless. And so this allows folks to have lots of language, lots of tools, and capacity to actually have the conversation. And it changes the culture internally when you're talking about it in those terms. So for me, it really is about taking all of that stuff, doing some sort of synthesis and looking for themes around all of it, and and not taking ourselves too seriously. I think I'll just add that in. It's like, part of it is it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be rigorous science. It has to be as good as you all can get it because you want the right information. And that's really relevant. And people get really a little confused about that. And I'm like, no, 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 let yourself off the hook. It's okay. You did 55 interviews. That's enough, right? It's too much, but that's all right. That's enough. You did really well, right? So that's my perspective.
I appreciate that so much because I think that brings me back to, when we're talking about data for internal purposes, we're talking about, how we know if our programs are successful, how we know if we're making a difference and impact. And Sarah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, like, get us started, some of the building trust in the community and how you get consent from folks when you're collecting. Like, what are some of the things to keep in mind for folks when they're getting started collecting data?
Yeah, this is something I'm personally trying to get better at and encouraging organizations to get better at. It's possible to tell the story of an organization without kind of exploiting some of the hardships that people we're serving might be facing. And I think as a sector, we have a long way to go in this. Like, just because someone's receiving free legal advice doesn't mean their face needs to be plastered on social media, unless that kind of marketing is something they, understand and agreed to and didn't feel coerced to agree to. And the same thing goes for data on intake forms. It's important to get consent for people to fill out things with personal information, but also some of these heart stories or blurbs we see on, end of the year appeal letters. It's important to not just get consent to include those, but for people to understand what they're being used for. I think we're, as a sector, having a better understanding that defining people by, the benefits they need or the programs they need is not helpful to anyone. So again, when we're sharing these stories, it's important to get consent and also be clear about the purpose of why that's being shared. I think that's especially important for organizations who are serving marginalized populations, under-resourced populations, or asking for stories from people who are in a lesser state of power than you are, to be using them in a very public way. I saw an example of this, on the news, we're seeing pictures of people in super long lines for food pantries. Well, those people didn't give permission for their faces to be shown on the national news. And I think when we're collecting data, especially when we're, starting to design a process like that, it's something to be very careful about and to avoid speaking about the people we're serving in a passive way or in a way that erases their humanity. Again, back to this organization that I work with that is working with older adults, it's easy for organizations to talk about older adults in a way that kind of erases their accomplishments or their contributions to the community, especially when we're talking about, needing volunteers to call them to see if they have groceries. But we have to be more mindful of how we're talking about that and then what it means for the information we're collecting about those people, which is important to communicate your impact, but to kind of have some ethical framework behind that is important.
Well, I for one, thank you for saying that out loud. I think it's really, really important that we just say that that's clearly just state that, yeah, we do need to have very clear conversations with folks as we use their information and their data. Super, super important. And I think I did a program with the YWCA. They were launching a national curriculum and it was all for young girls of color. And so I wanted to do individual interviews with them. And so I was very clear, Like they had to do informed consent, even though even though I wasn't really doing anything but an interview. We were really clear. We were like, this is what we're using this for. This is evaluation. This will be in the report. This might be in a news story. This might be something. So we were definitely, and it might be your face. It might be your name. What do you think, and how are you willing to participate? And they all had to get parental consent because of the deal we were working with, because of the agencies we were working with, and it allowed us to have many layers of protection. And when we got to the point where we were actually going to disclose, we were really comfortable with saying we're using this photo and we're using these pictures, and because we've done all of the work. And I think that also engendered trust with the folks that we were talking to. So when we came back and asked young ladies about what their experience was and what the process was, what would they change, what would they fix, they were super forthcoming because they trusted us, right? They told us that was terrible, it sucked, or this was super great, keep that, don't do this. And they were super specific. And these were young women then. They basically redesigned the program because their voices were allowed to be heard. And for me, that was a success. And it was all about maintaining that trust, confidentiality, and the process that was embedded in that. So thank you, Sarah, for saying that out loud. 2 thumbs up.
I'll add that it's super challenging to think this way, especially when things have been done in a specific way for so long. But again, like Arthur said, it can lead to better programs and better work all around. So to answer the question about getting consent, if it's like a written form, like on an intake form, not just having someone sign it, but making sure that they're understanding it. And I like when I'm including stories or kind of impact statements to actually have a conversation with someone, not just get a quote through email, but to make sure they understand this is going in an application for a grant funder so that we can, provide resources to continue this program for other people and that kind of thing, just being more transparent about it.
And I think that really nicely leads us into kind of the next section that we wanted to talk about of how to actually use this stuff. Like, what are strategy implications? What are program design implications? What are program impact implications? Margaret, you said something when we were preparing about being playful with data. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, definitely. I think, well, I can also show another example of, I come from a game-like learning background too, so it's hard not to kind of be playful with things. Sometimes I think that also makes things feel lower barrier to people. If you can just give them, say like, here, pick a card and like use that as your prompt, they feel much more like, oh, I'm just playing a game, right? It's not this big, heavy thing, right? We recently did this. Obviously, it's a little bit tougher as, oh no, I lost my slides. It can be tougher as a virtual. I'm so sorry, I forgot, I lost my slides. Here we go. But we developed something called Theory of Action Mad Libs with our with a whole bunch of staff that are working with media programs with youth in care. So some programs with kids in foster care, and then also with incarcerated youth. And so their programming had a whole separate logic model than just normal youth media classes. So we were working with this group, and I just want to show, just because it was virtual, we were able to do it as a, apologies, I don't know what that's about. We were able to do it as a mural board, kind of a virtual thing. So like I said, we had people identify what success looked like for them and sort of the categories of outcomes. It doesn't look like can you see it yet?
Not quite, but
there you go.
There it is.
So they were kind of sorting their categories of outcomes and then did a separate exercise where they categorized the inputs of their programming. So what they're all trying to do, and then kind connected inputs to outcomes. And this was just a playful thing, right? This was just the start. We're doing part 2 of this later on this week. But just saying, you know what success looks like. If we do this input, then we expect this outcome, right? And they could play around and move each other's ideas too. And a lot of them said, well, ooh, I also think like this outcome may result from that input. Have you ever thought about that, right? And kind of being playful in that way, because Mad Libs is just a game, right? There was no, it wasn't high stakes at all. And so it was a really good way to start brainstorming around impact that we may not have thought of before.
Well, I always have something to say, so I'll jump in. So back in the day, 100 years ago, when I was doing a project with young people, we were doing systems mapping, and we were trying to figure out how to find the intersections in all of the programs that these young people were participating in. And so we decided to do, they did data collection, but they had all this paper, and they're like, I don't know what to say. So we ended up doing an art project, basically, and it was a suspended, it wasn't anything. It was a big thing hanging from the ceiling. It was made out of pipe cleaners, whatever those things are called nowadays, but you know what I'm talking about. And those things they were all over, and at all the intersections, young people they spent weeks doing this. They would sit there and have conversations under this thing and say, well, this looks like an intersection. And what they were looking at were intersections where they could focus their attention. So they wanted the programs to focus their attention on the intersections that youth were experiencing, whatever that was. And I don't remember the details, but it was this huge thing that hung out. It hung out for weeks, must have been 8 or 10 weeks that we all played with it. And it had stickies everywhere and notes, and at some point they started creating figures and little paper pictures. So it was a big, beautiful piece of artwork. But at the same time, it became our strategic plan. And the young people were able to take this thing, and they took it to the board, and they explained it, and they discussed it, and they organized it for the board to say, this is what we've done. And the board approved their plan, and we basically reorganized the agency because of that. So it's one way of how you use data internally, and how you collect it, and how it's playful. It was all of those things, and young people were super engaged, and they really participated in earnest. And so that to me was super successful. It was a great process.
Well, and I'm also thinking about, you're collecting that data, that time piece. I want to dig into that a little bit more, because I feel like, when I've gone through strategic planning programs before, there's a lot of like, okay, you have 30 minutes or an hour or whatever to engage with this, to fill out the survey, to tell us everything you think. How do you all feel that time allotment feeds into data collection, like what works, what doesn't work? It can seem messy to like the idea of something being out there just for a week. I can feel like I hear folks that would be concerned, like, well, what if somebody just tore it all down? What would we do? I don't know, just any thoughts you have for that, of how the timing of collection works and impacts folks.
I had never thought of that. It creates a great deal of anxiety just saying it.
I think in terms of the time for, if you're holding a focus group or something, or if a survey is only available for a week, the most important thing is just noting that limitation. So, you can get this data, and you can have a conversation in an hour-long focus group, but when you step back and look at what was actually said and transcribe those things, noting to yourself that this was an hour of someone's time, nothing you do is going to be a full enough picture to tell you everything, and just, keeping in mind the circumstances behind it. In terms of something getting ripped down, I don't know. I also have anxiety about that.
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. And I think also just think about kind of, I don't think it's the right word, but triangulating different sources of data, right? So yes, we have that focus group. It was only with one group. It was only for an hour. We have this group, and then we have this source, and then we have that survey, and then we have these photos, and we have this. So kind of and again, internally, like, using that to kind of start to draw conclusions and thinking about it as not just data, but documentation of what's going on and trying to find as many perspectives as you can in that way. So yeah, so if something gets torn down, well, you got some other stuff too.
I regret giving that example. I think I gave myself anxiety. But Margaret, I'm so glad you said that, because that was exactly the next question I was thinking of, I certainly don't want to give the impression that like surveys are bad or that more simple tools are not useful, especially for folks that are getting started. So I wonder if you can, I love that, triangulating data from many sources. I wrote that down and I'm definitely coming back to it. But if you can talk a little bit more about that, of like, how do you fit together maybe something, maybe folks have like a data collection tool that already exists, but they also want to do something creative. How do you kind of fit those things together?
I mean, I think, like some people have said earlier on, looking at existing structures and how you can kind of work within those. If you have a survey that you might do, then also looking at, well, what programming is going on? How can we just sort of do some documentation of what's already happening, and just pull that source, talk to some people, pull that source, look at maybe some more public data and kind of compare it. So I don't know if that really answers part of what you were asking, but I think for us, it's always been about like, how can we build, I think it always helps build a fuller picture of what's going on. And then again, creates more buy-in for the people involved in the work. So if we're doing a project, I want to know what's going on at that organization before I start making suggestions. And so I want to hear from as many people as possible. But that could just be showing up when things are already happening, right? Or like Arthur said, like sending a camera, right?
I totally agree with that. I like to do surveys. If it's a multi-stage data collection process, I like to do surveys toward the beginning because you can blast it out to a ton of people pretty quickly. And then using some of these more creative ways or, community conversations or focus groups to dive in more in depth than you could with a survey, especially if something on the survey was surprising to you or you want to explore it further, adding on something like, Mad Libs or again, a focus group would kind of give you that opportunity to explore it further than just a single point in time survey. So I think combining those things is the best possible situation. And then again, it relates back to the triangulation comment that if what is said in those conversations following the survey supports those findings, then you have more confidence that your data is valid and actionable.
And for me, I think it's a little bit of all of that. I'd use the tools depending on what the situation is. Sometimes I start with interviews because that's what the agency needs. They need to talk to people. They need to be in listening mode. That's what they need. And then we'll do surveys, or we'll do a whole bunch of surveys and say, okay, that gives us some data for our focus groups. And then once we do the focus groups, I'm like, oh, here's a couple of questions that are coming up. Let's survey these questions and go back. So it's all that kind of stuff. So and mostly what I'm trying to do is get folks that are participating in the process to say, I need data about this. I want this. And then we discuss, okay, what's the best way to get that particular data? And it might be a survey. It might be the easiest way. And it could be that it's interviews. And I've done everything from community conversations to individual interviews and everything in between, right? So all of those are reasonable. I think most of them are, it's always what do you call it? A plethora of all of those. It's always a mix of all of those. I've never done just one in any situation in a data collection strategy. I've never used just one. It's been at least 3, mostly 4 or 5 different data collection strategies. So that's just my way of looking at how you triangulate the data. I love that. I also, by the way, we're going to steal that.
Well, and for folks on the call that might already be exhausted thinking about all these different ways of collecting data, I wanted to come back to the public source data. I think all of you have, I'm sure you have, worked with public sources of data, but where do you start to find those? What types of public data are generally available? Are there Are there specific places you go to that are always reliable and helpful, or sources that you would say absolutely stay away from that one, it's the worst?
I can answer to Chicago more specifically, probably. I use the census website constantly. It used to be American Fact Finder, now it's data.census.gov. There's so much information in there, and I will be honest, it is not immediately intuitive to use. But if you have a little bit of time and start playing around with it, you kind of get the feel for things. And you can search by very specific geography down to census block, census tract, all the way up to the entire country on not just population, but on income measures, changes over time. So there's just a ton of general public data available there. For Chicago specifically, the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning has some really great community data snapshots by each of the, I think, 77 community areas in the city. And those touch on all kinds of indicators, health, economic, social indicators, all kinds of stuff in there. Local municipalities often have data. The city of Chicago does. I'm based in Lake County, and our county website has a lot of interactive maps and things. I think maps is something we haven't touched on in terms of what data might look like, but that's also a great resource. And the last one for the city, there's a website, chicagohealthatlas.org, has more health and human services specific data. I found that to find those types of websites, if they don't show up in Google, to go to your local government, sometimes they'll just be listed in extra resources. But also if you have a good local community foundation, those are often hubs of kind of local research studies, data sets. And if they don't have them on their websites, I found that people who work at those foundations can certainly point you in the right direction.
Yeah, I wouldn't add anything necessarily more. That would be what I would say. Same thing is available for school related data. That's fairly easy to find locally. And then occasionally, because we work with workforce readiness organizations, we use ONET, which is the Department of Labor. So if you're specifically in that, it's a pretty robust website.
In public data sets, there's tons of them, right? There's youth risk data sets. There's the Youth Behavioral Health Survey. There's a whole bunch of them. There's a whole bunch of them that the federal government does that are, fairly reasonable data sets that are longitudinal, have a lot of data over a long period of time. So there's a lot of that, and that's definitely one of the first steps. Is let's do that. Let's look at what's available right here, right now. And again, it's data mining and data literacy, so it's a good process to go through. Yeah. Thanks, Sarah. That was really great. Well done.
Total nerd in this area. So if anyone needs a more specific reference, let me know.
Thanks, Sarah. And we have a great follow-up question in the chat, and I'm also going to use this as an opportunity to say to everybody in our audience, as it were, we're about to open up for questions from all of you directly. So get your fingers warmed up to enter those in the chat. Feel free to go ahead and enter them. But we have one already that is from Tanya. What are your suggestions for a best free source to share data, especially when there's a lot of it and not everyone is tech savvy or has the patience to sift through it? They've tried Google Sheets, but it doesn't seem to be a good fit for everyone. Any recommendations?
Well, I'm a big fan of a lot of them. One of the good parts about most of these the cloud-based services and the newer ones, especially Google services, is it does a lot of the data analysis for you. So it can be really, really simple. Once you get the sheet and you click that little explore button down at the bottom, it produces a whole bunch of tables and graphs, and that's really what you're looking for in terms of talking to people and representing the data. It's like, here's a table. It's very simple to read, and you don't have to read 55,000 data points, right? This is the table. And so Google Sheets does that really well. So if people are struggling, I would strongly encourage taking a couple of short, quick courses. The internet has a ton of them, and mostly because I think the reason I like Google Sheets is because it's accessible to almost everybody. It's free, and everybody can access it, have access to it. Whereas with Word and all of the other stuff, it's doable, but it's also a little complicated. So with a Google product, you can do slideshows and all of that, and it makes it super easy. And that's another way to do that data presentation, is use the Google slide feature and create your own slides. So just as an FYI, I do a lot of training on how to use Google Docs, by the way. So if anybody needs help with that, let me know, because it's critical. It's critical. And I have trained everybody. And I was working with a group of women who were writing a book, and they were all, I think they were all in their 60s and over. They had never done any of this. And by the end of the second month, they were all doing a lot of Google Sheets, Google Docs, and spreadsheets and all that stuff. They were really quite versed. So it takes a little bit of time. There's a little bit of a barrier, but the barrier is manageable. That's my feeling.
I would echo that. I haven't used anything, more specialized than any of the Google products. I found sometimes Google Sheets can be clunky if you're used to the shortcuts in Excel. But often the challenge seems to be in actually analyzing the data rather than accessing it through the tool itself. So I found in those kind of situations, having, if you're sending out raw data, for example, having someone who can easily and clearly analyze it, send out a quick summary to go along with it. So you're not throwing people into the woods with, a massive spreadsheet.
That's where we came along. That's what we do.
I know a lot of organizations also use SurveyMonkey. Have any of you had experience with that, or worked with organizations that have had it? Do you recommend them? Do you not recommend them? What are your feelings?
So I'm not the one in our organization that is designing most of the surveys, but my business partner definitely prefers SurveyMonkey when it comes to surveying different groups. We've tried both and just kind of sprang for the SurveyMonkey because it just allowed for a lot more flexibility.
I completely echo those statements as well. I've tried a bunch of different tools for survey dissemination, and SurveyMonkey is just consistently helpful. There's an analysis tool built in. They have text analysis now for, more open-ended questions. So aside from the barrier of a subscription, there's not a lot of flaws with SurveyMonkey.
The same thing. If you can afford it, then yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of different programs out there that'll do forms that are integrated, Microsoft and Office and all of those. They all have them. So they work. Again, access is important to me. So I definitely focus on free or no cost services, especially for smaller nonprofits. A lot of the nonprofits I work with are teeny tiny, like 2. Right. And it's like, okay, that Google is perfect. So yeah, that's the perspective.
All right. Well, I definitely want to, again, invite folks to enter their own questions. What brought you here to the conversation today? If your questions have been answered, that's great. If you have one that's still pressing, we are open to that. But I don't want to get away today without seeing, and I hope that you have them handy. Otherwise, Margaret, I'm sorry. But you had shared before a really beautiful infographic. Do you still have that?
I showed an infographic?
It was like a end of year report as an infographic. Am I misremembering?
Yeah. Yes. Let me find it. Why don't you do some questions and I'll look around me.
Absolutely. I was just thinking of, Arthur brought up also end of year reports. So maybe if Arthur or Sarah, you could talk about, in addition to program evaluation or strategic planning, what are some of the other ways that you can use this multiple data? Because I certainly am a subscriber to work smarter, not harder. So what are ways that we can, if we've collected all of this stuff, how else can it be?
I think definitely in fundraising, and a lot of that will come down to segmentation. So in the very beginning, we were talking about data supporting how you tell your story and strengthening your narrative. So the same thing goes with fundraising. If you are, for example, if I'm a volunteer for your organization and I'm getting a year-end appeal letter, I probably want to hear about the amazing impact your team of volunteers is making, and how that's affected your outcomes. So if you have data already that you've been collecting that supports that you can then tailor for the audience, your volunteers, that's just going to strengthen your ask, and it's going to make me feel like I'm making a difference and will want to continue making a difference through a financial contribution. The same goes for donors, telling them what you raised, how it impacted what you did, and what your outcomes were. And it doesn't mean that you need to collect different data, but if you already have it as part of a strategic planning process or as part of a program evaluation, you can just use that, change how you're talking about it for a way that will help improve your organization.
So for me, what we did, I did when I was working with the program, I had a staff person that was the liaison between the program and the funders. And so every time I would send them a report, they would send it back saying the funders don't want to read that much paperwork. It's like 5,000 papers. They have no interest. So no matter what we did, we always had to take that data and manipulate it to something that was manageable for this particular group. And it was a lot of money. So I will tell you that it's kind of silly, but in the end, it worked. And it was a huge amount of money. And they wanted a PowerPoint. They wanted 10 slides or 6 slides, or I don't know. They gave me a very specific number, this board funder group did. And so we took the data from that final report and we synthesized it into something that was a 6-page, but it was based on the valid data from the report and all the data collection. So while it looked very minuscule and meaningless in the end, as we were handing it off to the funder, it was actually based on a huge amount of work and a huge amount of information. And so they had access to the information. If they wanted to find more, they could click it, or they could just read that and get that synthesis. So the point being is that you could use it for an executive summary, they could use it for funders, and they could use it for their actual reporting. But they use that data in so many different ways, in a variety of different ways. And most of it was to get funding. As Sarah said, a lot of it was to make a solid argument for increased funding. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and we'll certainly dig in. I know in May we'll be coming back to this conversation about data for storytelling with a really explicit focus on how we use data to tell external folks our story, both donors and funders and the community broadly. But we had a great question come in on the chat, so I'm going to pivot back to that one. Adrian said many organizations have had their traditional data skewed by 2021. Yes, definitely. Any advice on how to report this fact or new data out to potential funders? Or I'm also going to add to that, Adrian, I hope you don't mind, of how to account for this like outlier data in our internal work as well.
I can speak to at least the first half of that, in that everyone's 2020 looked super weird. Either you served a lot more people, depending on what your organization does, or lockdowns prevented you from serving a lot of people. Maybe, you had huge expenses to adjust to remote work or to provide services remotely. And I found that being proactive in those kinds of conversations with funders has been not as stressful as you might think. Funders have generally been really supportive and understanding of the impact that COVID has had on nonprofit organizations. And I don't think any funder could realistically expect organizations to duplicate the work they did in 2019 in the 2020 environment. So again, no organization had a normal year last year. And if you're being transparent about it, and showing, here, maybe 2020 revealed some flaws in your program, and you use the data that you were able to collect to improve that in the future. Just again, being transparent about it has been very helpful. And I've had some of these conversations with clients and funders in the past couple months, and it hasn't been a problem at all. Susie, I forgot the second part of your question.
Well, similarly to communicating it to funders, but if you are using data for program planning or program feedback, how do you sort of account for that when you're when we know that this year is not typical data?
And I think, when we were talking about the time piece, recognizing that this is a limitation, um, if you're tracking things over time and there's a huge dip in 2020, you know why. And the more important piece is how you're coming out of it. So what does your data look like in 2021 that shows that you have addressed some of those problems and, kind of looked at your shortcomings, looked at your successes, seen what's gone well because of the wonderful outcomes you've been tracking, and showing improvement coming out of COVID into a recovery period. I think 2021 is more important than the dip that we'll see in 2020.
Yeah, sorry, I was looking for something, so I didn't catch the beginning, but I did want to say that I think with some of our partners, it's been about just sort of like we've been talking about before, documenting what's going on, documenting what the responses have been, and then trying to pull some insights out of that. And at least, I mean, being in the learning space, that was helpful because everybody was suddenly reinventing what learning looked like. And so some of our partners were able to then help, for themselves kind of think about, well, what have we done? How do we categorize these things? What are these approaches? And are they actually maybe working better? Who knows? And then also turn that into some external communication that sort of positioned them as a little bit of a leader in the space, having kind of responded in a certain way and sort of taking ownership of their responses.
So we've covered a pretty wide range of things, and I'm still inviting folks to continue as questions pop into your head or things that you're thinking about. Share those in the chat. If you want to take yourself off mute and speak them into the room, or if you want to come on camera, you're welcome to do that as well, whatever is most comfortable for you. But while folks are still thinking, I also wanted to ask you all to share what your action step would be for folks. Like I said, we've talked about a lot of things, but if you were to say, what's the one step you would ask somebody to take next, what would that be?
Do you want our action steps right now? I have one, but I want to make sure it's the right time.
Yeah, I think we can go ahead and start sharing those while we're waiting for more questions to come in the chat. And I did just, we got one, so I can actually buy you a little bit of time if you want to start with that first.
Oh, I have an action step.
All right, go for it.
Throw off our rhythm. So I would advise if you're looking to start a new data collection process or see what you could be doing differently, ask yourself the question, so what? Whether it's talking about what you're already doing, ask yourself, so what? What does this mean for us? Does this show we're making a difference? Does it not? Is it something we don't need to be collecting? Because when we ask ourselves, so what, we can't answer that question. So, we've been talking about how important it is to collect data and all these different ways you can do it, but it's also important to not collect data that you're not going to need. I'm sure no one on this call has free time to be sifting through spreadsheets that aren't relevant or don't make a difference to your organization. So asking yourself what matters, so what, I think will keep you pointed in a right direction, working within this environment of limited resources.
Yeah, I mean, so what, and then sort of maybe I would just add to who. And then when you have that to who, then invite those people in to help you with a strategy that is extra relevant.
And I think for me, the first step I have always is what questions remain unanswered for you? What are you doing? Why are we here? What's the unanswered question? Because that's really starting at the beginning. What questions do you have that remain unanswered? And then let's start with the process there. And again, it really is problem specific and agency specific, person specific, maybe even, right? So, but again, yeah, I think that makes sense to me.
I think that couldn't have been better if we'd scripted it. So what, to who, what questions are still unanswered? That's a really powerful combination. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for that. I want to flip back to the question from Hillary, which I'm also really excited to see what you all have to say. Related to providing data to funders, has anyone ever worked with nonprofits to push back on a funder's request for data? For example, maybe because the org doesn't track that specific data and the funding doesn't provide the resources needed to do so, or the nonprofit felt the data is not aligned with the organization's mission.
I work with an organization that they have a bunch of different programs, but one of them is operating as a regional food distribution center that supplies local food banks and local food pantries, which they've been writing more grant applications for this year. There's increased need because of COVID. But funders wanted to know, well, how many people are served through this? And the agency doesn't track it almost intentionally for some of the reasons we were talking about before, that it's a privacy thing. They don't want people to feel like this extra barrier of filling out a form to get food would impact their families. So they just kind of explained again, this is what we do. This is how much food we send out, but we don't have a number. We won't have a number. And these are the reasons why. And I think organizations that operate similarly sensitive programs would have similar answers to that, that sometimes it's just not appropriate to collect data from the people we're serving. But if you can, provide a different output or a different outcome explaining your work, then you can address it that way. But being able to explain to funders that you really value these things and you want to uphold these values above reporting on them publicly can go a long way.
Well, I definitely, yeah. Okay. Well, one thing is I'm definitely an activist when it comes to this. So when there's definitely an opportunity to scream back at funders constantly because there's a lot of inappropriate questions. That's for one. Nonetheless, and so yes, the answer is yes. I've always pushed back when that question came up, and I think Sarah said it really well because the need required it. And the most recent project I worked on that had this issue was a homeless shelter, and they were required to report all the data on all of these young people, or because we were in Seattle, they would be penalized if they didn't reach a certain amount of data collection. They would lose X amount of their funding for that month. It was quite draconian. And so we were struggling because this little nonprofit really didn't have enough flexibility to absorb that, and they didn't collect that data, as Sarah said, because it wasn't relevant. It wasn't important. This person is suffering from homelessness. It's like, let's talk about your sex life. No, we're not doing that. We're just not doing that, right? So it was really important. So in the end, the final result was I literally had to go through the city council and get it. I had to do a legislative process to get that reversed, but we did get excused from that so that we were no longer required to do that, and we were placed in a different category. So outside of the entire homeless system in Seattle, we were an outlier because I decided that the data collection requirements were unethical and I was going to fight for it. So yes, absolutely you can do it. Takes a little bit of work, but it's the right thing to do. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions come up, so I'm going to take one more awkwardly long pause just in case someone was waiting that they wanted to be the very last question, and then we'll start to wrap up. So awkward pause. You've been prepared. Thumbs up. Thank you, Val. So I'm going to take that as a sign to go ahead and move on to our close. Again, today's program was a partnership with Forefront and the Association of Consultants to Nonprofits. I talked about at the beginning, when we first thought of this, we were trying to find a way to connect information to people that needed it. And then this whole Ask a Consultant program sort of grew and continued out of that because we wanted to hold a space for folks to connect. So I really hope that folks that joined us in the conversation today got some concrete information. I know affirming what you're already doing, triangulating data from different sources, asking so what, to who, what questions are still unanswered. Those are just a couple of the highlights that I'm taking away from this. But in addition to the information, I hope that everyone felt a little bit more connected and a little bit less alone today. Thank you, all of the folks that joined as participants, and thank you, Sarah and Arthur and Margaret. We really appreciate your time so much. With that, I'm going to give folks about 20 minutes back in their day and say, I hope we see you at the next Ask a Consultant program, and have a great day.